Why is Ukraine the West's fault?
Why is Ukraine the West's fault? It's very simple. The Russians made it clear when we first announced that Ukraine was going to become a member of NATO in April 2008 that they viewed this as an existential threat. To use Bill Burns' terminology, he was then the U.S. ambassador to Moscow. This was the brightest of red lines for Moscow. Putin told us in April 2008 that he would wreck Ukraine before he would let it come into NATO. Nevertheless, the West, and here we're talking mainly about the United States, continued to push forward to bring Ukraine into NATO. In February 2014, a crisis broke out. And what did the United States do? It simply doubled down. Our basic view was we could shove NATO expansion down the Russians' throat. That's NATO expansion into Ukraine, just as we had shoved NATO expansion down their throat in 1999 and in 2004. But Putin made it clear that this was a bridge too far. We refused to accept their position, and we continued to push hard. And in February of 2022, the war that is now taking place broke out. Therefore, we are principally responsible because we pushed NATO expansion into Ukraine, which is the major cause of this war.
To what end did we push NATO expansion into Ukraine?
Well, we thought we could get away with it, and we wanted to create a NATO that covered all of Europe right up to Russia's border. We had gotten away with it. The 2004 expansion included the Baltic states. And we thought that given that we had forced the Russians to accept the Baltic states in NATO in 2004, that we could do the same with Ukraine after 2008. And the Russians, again, made it clear that that was unacceptable. But for us, we had an open door policy with regard to NATO. And we thought it was perfectly acceptable to have Ukraine and Georgia and other countries that were part of the former Soviet Union in NATO. The Russians felt differently.
Whence came this attitude that we could use Ukraine as a battering ram with which to drive Vladimir Putin from office, this Victoria Nuland theory?
Where did it come from?
Yes.
I think that we believed that once the war started, we could defeat the Russians. If you look at the run up to the war, the 3 months before the war started, this is December 2021, January 2022, and then most of February of 2022. It's very clear that the Russians were trying to cut a deal with us and to avoid war. We did virtually nothing to avoid a war. It's really quite remarkable.
Were we communicating with the Russians in that era, unlike the last 2 years of Biden's presidency?
The answer is hardly at all. And then the war starts, and the Russians immediately reach out to the Ukrainians to talk about negotiations to end the war. This is right after it starts. The Russians want to end it. The Ukrainians agree, and the famous negotiations in Istanbul start. And as you well know, who ends those negotiations? It's not the Ukrainians, it's not the Russians, it's the Americans and the British in the form of Boris Johnson, who come in and tell the Ukrainians that they should walk away from the negotiations. Now, you want to ask yourself, what's going on here? What's going on is we thought that we could defeat the Russians. This is why we didn't try to prevent the war, and why, once it started, we didn't go along with Putin's efforts to stop the war. We thought we had the Russians and Putin right where we wanted them. We thought that we had armed and trained the Ukrainians to the point where they could hold their own on the battlefield. And furthermore, economic sanctions would deliver a really staggering blow to the Russians. And that combination of economic sanctions plus defeat on the battlefield would knock the Russians out of the ranks of the great powers, and it would end up with Putin falling from power. That was the basic mindset that we had. And again, as I've said a long time ago on this show, you want to remember that General Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, in the fall of 2022, said that Ukraine, after successes on the battlefield, had reached the high water mark, and it was time to negotiate an end to the war. This is what the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff says in the fall of 2022. The Biden administration tells him to close his mouth and continues to push forward with the war. And the question is why? Because we thought that it was not the high water mark for the Ukrainians, that things would only improve over time, and we would, in effect, finish the Russians off as a great power. Of course, we were categorically wrong. One could say just catastrophically wrong. And the people who are paying the price for our foolishness are the Ukrainians.
So 2 years after the coup in 2014, two Republican senators visited Ukraine, John McCain and Lindsey Graham. Here's what they said.
Your fight is our fight.
Ваша боротьба – це наша боротьба.
2017 will be the year of offense.
Рік 2016 рік буде ріком нападу.
All of us will go back to Washington and we will push the case against Russia.
Ми всі повернемося до Вашингтону і ми будемо відстоювати санкції проти Росії.
Enough of a Russian aggression.
Досить вже російської агресії.
It is time for them to pay a heavier price.
Час вже щоб вони заплатили важчу ціну.
I believe you will win. I am convinced you will win, and we will do everything we can to provide you with what you need to win.
Я вірю.
No, there was no war going on, or was there in 2017?
Well,
Donald Trump was relatively new in the White House. McCain, whom he hated, was making these statements. Graham, who repeated everything McCain said what he said. Who was calling the shots?
Well, the thing is that you want to remember that when Donald Trump came into office, he tried to improve relations with Russia, and he had no interest in starting a war in Ukraine. But he was unable to improve relations with Russia. And in fact, the blob, the foreign policy establishment, forced him to start arming Ukraine. It was Donald Trump, not Barack Obama, who started arming Ukraine. And of course, we were training Ukrainian units at the same time.
But can you decipher what Senator Graham was talking about? You will win the war. And he's surrounded by these guys in uniform and carrying weapons. What war?
Well, a lot of people called the war that was taking place, or the conflict that was taking place in eastern Ukraine, in the Donbass, after 2014, a war. That's what he's talking about.
Okay.
In other words, when the crisis breaks out in February of 2014, it eventually, actually, it rather quickly leads to a civil war in the eastern part of Ukraine, the Donbass area. That is what he is referring to. We usually refer to that as just a conflict, and the war is what happens after February 2022. But he's referring to the conflict in eastern Ukraine. And we are training up and arming the Ukrainians to win that fight in eastern Ukraine after 2014 and before 2022.
Wow. And you believe that Ukraine is on its last leg now. I've already asked you that. Where are negotiations going to go between the United States and Russia? The Kremlin must be laughing at us. We're a co-belligerent. How can we be a mediator?
Well, the negotiations are going to go nowhere. That's what Monday's telephone conversation between Putin and Trump shows us. And it basically looks like Trump is now going to walk away from the problem. I mean, what else is he going to do? He has two choices here. He can either accept Russia's demands, or he can walk away. I mean, there is a third option, which I think is untenable, and he's made it clear it's untenable, which is that he can become Joe Biden #2, and he can continue to try to support the Ukrainians. But he said he's not going to do that. So he has two choices. He can concede to the Russians their major demands, which he's not going to do, or he can walk away. And I think he's going to walk away. This one's going to be settled on the battlefield, and the Russians are going to win.
Can
And
the Europeans replace the Americans if and when Trump walks away?
absolutely not. The Europeans have been doing everything they can since this war started to help the Ukrainians. They just don't have the weaponry in the closet to pull out and give to the Ukrainians to make up for what we're giving the Ukrainians. But furthermore, even when the Europeans and the Americans were working together under Joe Biden to support the Ukrainians, even then the Ukrainians were losing. So if you take us out of the equation, the idea that the Europeans can replace us and we can stymie the Russians and even push them back is ludicrous. It's just not a serious argument. Once you take us out of the equation, the Ukrainians are doomed. And I would argue they're doomed even with us in the equation.